I want to be before. Yeah.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Great Decisions 2026, our 20th anniversary of Great Decisions at Manitowoc. So before we get started, I will turn things over to Professor Toral very quickly, but there are three people that I've worked with the past decade that I want to single out because without them, I wouldn't have known the ropes to help put this thing together year in, year out. So if I could please have these three people stand up and get a round of applause for them. Marilyn Sante, Charlie Wenger, and Kathy Fisher. Without them, I wouldn't know anything about putting this together. I'm so grateful to them. They've been spectacular to work with. Let's hope we're all around for the 40th anniversary of Great Decisions. So, before I turn things over, just a few quick things. I would be remiss if I did not thank our sponsors. So, a big thank you to the League of Women Voters of Manitowoc County, the Manitowoc Public Library Foundation, the Manitowoc Public Library, and the Lakeshore Unitarian Universalist Fellowship. So a big round of applause for us. And then the last thing, because you certainly didn't come to hear me talk. Trust me, he knows a lot more than I do, pretty much about everything from what I can tell. If you're interested in purchasing the companion publication that goes along with the Great Decision series, they are available at the front desk, $15 cash or check. So that is, oh, Darlene, hold it up. See, not only does she teach me things, she's our chair of Merrill as well. So without further ado, Professor Pablo Toral.
Thank you. So I also would like to extend my gratitude. Is it on? That suggests that it's not. It should be now.
It should be now.
Yes. So I also would like to extend my gratitude to all three of you for the amazing work that you've been doing since I began coming here. You definitely were the ones who invited me and, treated me like royalty. So thank you very much. I also want to thank the sponsors because obviously they wouldn't make this possible, but I also want to thank the audience and Manitowoc because getting so many people out some of the coldest nights of the year to talk about tariffs, it takes a lot of courage and interest. So I think it is commendable that you're doing this. I also enjoy coming here. I normally come into town later in the summer for my own enjoyment and those of visitors that I'd like to take around Wisconsin. So thank you. So I will now turn on to my talk. I was invited to give a presentation based on the article on Trump tariffs, I think it's called, and the impact on the economy. So a couple of things on myself that Tim always likes me to include. I'm professor of environmental studies and international relations at Beloit College. I happen to be the chair of environmental studies and political science department right now. My interest as a person trained and teaching interdisciplinarily straddle anything from the social sciences to the natural sciences related to the environment and political economy of the environment in particular. If I had to define my field of expertise, it would be that. So I'm currently working on 2 books, which actually I said last year it was. My books are going a little more slowly than expected, in part because my co-author, Felix Martin, has been dealing with sciatica, which is really not good in general, particularly for doing research. So we were just exchanging a few messages this morning, and he said, I'm 80% back. So that was very good. What I'd like to do now is always open with the structure of my presentation. I organized it in 4 different sections. The first one is I'd like to go over the reading that we've done, the one that's in the chapter. Whether you have done it or not, I wanted to make sure that, I did justice to the author, because my experience is that, this series always brings a major expert in the topic that they decide to address. Michael Mastanduna actually is a person who I became very familiar with when I was in graduate school, when I came to the US to pursue my PhD. He's an expert on US foreign policy. He's got lots of years of experience studying foreign policy, so he's a very prominent scholar. He's teaching at Dartmouth College, where one of Beloit College alumni is also a very prominent professor there, so we do have a connection with them. The second section of my presentation will try to move beyond his arguments into a reality check of sorts. So a lot has happened since he wrote this piece. So I wanted to talk about or look into the data to see to what extent protectionism has, if it has impacted the American economy. The third thing I'd like to do is to assess what he calls 3 potential future scenarios. His argument is a lot has happened since the election of Donald Trump. What's coming in the future? So he has 3 ideas, and he thinks it could be one of these 3. So I also will look into the evidence that we have since he wrote this piece to try to see what direction we seem to be going, or there might be a 4th one. I actually think it's one of those 3, so there won't be a 4th one. And then I'd like to conclude with a few ideas, talking points, maybe stress a few things that I think are important from the readings and some that are not, that when we study foreign policy in general, we like to think about and we like to tell the students, and those were not necessarily in the article, but it does help to put tariffs in a broader perspective of economic policy and foreign policy. So with that, I'm going to quickly go through the main arguments in Mastanduna's argument in his piece. And he starts by talking about Liberation Day, April 2nd, 2025, when President Trump announced significant tariffs on the imports coming from a number of countries, on the grounds that these countries were taking unfair advantage of the U.S. economy, and the tariffs were going to be put in place to right those wrongs. So the assumption behind these policies that were announced was the idea that if other countries ran a trade surplus with the U.S. and the U.S. Facing a trade imbalance, there's got to be something unfair about how those countries got there. Because in the past, tariffs were normally used to right wrongs, right? Social wrongs, policy wrongs, unfair discrimination, unfair treatment from other countries. These are the context in which these policies, these instruments of policy are implemented. President Trump also argued that these issues are a matter of national emergency. So I also wanted to dig a little bit into what that really meant, because there's legal grounds for that claim. And another argument that I think is important in Mastanduna's piece at the beginning, he basically says, is U.S. world leadership eroding, or is the U.S. resigning as a leader? I think that's a very important question, but I don't think he really comes back to that later in the article. I don't necessarily think it's that useful in a way, but I really wanted to call your attention to that. So I'm putting a few flags in different places for us to think about. So that's the big general argument that he develops. So the next step, what he does is President Trump seems to like to centralize power. So it makes a lot of sense for us to think about his understanding of power, his understanding of policy, because if we know that, we will be able to explain why he does what he does and what might be coming down the pipeline in the future. So how does he approach policy making? Transactional. He takes a transactional approach. He really emphasizes striking deals with other countries, mostly with individual countries. We call this bilateralism, 1 to 1. The US versus one country, the US versus country B, the US versus country C. So the second argument is a centralized approach to policy. The president decides what's done, and then the bureaucracy executes it. But it is the president that offers the leadership. And the third characteristic is, and this is a really important one, is the emphasis on policy instruments. The president finds policy instruments that he believes are going to allow him to work with other countries or get other countries to make concessions, as opposed to focusing on policy goals. And this is a really important distinction to be made. When we teach students policy, it's important for us to realize that tariffs are instruments of policy. They're not policy. They're part of a strategy. A policy is a strategy that is developed by a country, although you could say an organization, a business, to achieve a particular goal. So it's just a strategy that should be made clear to people so that we all walk in the same direction towards the same goal. And normally a policy tries to fix a problem. So we start with a problem, and the end is the solution. And with that, we come up with a strategy. But the strategy has to be able to identify the key actors or players. Who is going to do what? So that, we don't go against each other. Another thing that needs to be done is to identify the instruments that those people will have to implement those strategies. And that's where tariffs comes in. Tariff is one of many instruments that someone will be using to facilitate the policy goals. Another one is the resources. A policy without resources is just rhetoric. Someone has to be given particular resources to mobilize those instruments to achieve those policy goals that would help us get the problem to go away. But this takes decades to put together. Policies are very hard to develop because, especially when we talk about countries, they require millions of people going in the same direction. So the government will give us the policy goals, and they will accord citizens a particular function in that strategy. Some of us will be asked to consume, to buy certain things. Businesses will be asked to prioritize the production or development of certain goods or technologies. We might need to get the collaboration of other governments, which is normally the hardest part to do, because domestic policy is easier to implement than foreign policy. One of the principles of international relations is the principle informed by the Treaty of Westphalia, the idea that every country is sovereign and nobody is to dictate what other countries need to do. However, in international relations, the point of foreign policy is to get other countries to agree to do what you want them to do to help you further your goals. But you can't tell them what to do. You have to find a way to persuade them to help you out. And normally that works best with a system of incentives, positive incentives, as opposed to negative incentives. Positive incentives, if you do this for me, I'll do that for you. There might not be a lot for you on this one. There's a lot for me, but when you need my help, you let me know. This is normally the way that these relationships get built over time, and then they get formalized by treaties into international law. Those treaties are the result of practice, which eventually become written into paper so that we have a frame of legal reference that tells us how we are to conduct ourselves. That matters, but it's not what the president's foreign policy does. Instead, the president identifies one of the instruments of foreign policy and then pursues the mobilization of those instruments without having a clear idea of what the ultimate policy goal is. That's one of the critical arguments that Mastandino is making. In that sense, the president is an innovator. He's doing foreign policy like nobody has done before. And normally, when you do something like this, there's lots of risks that come with it. Because if nobody has done it before, why is it? Because it doesn't work? Or because nobody was smart enough to figure it out? So those are the kinds of questions that scholars are really asking right now. So the president is really taking a risk by following this course, which is not normally the route that international relations go. So, what is at stake when we use tariffs? So there is a number of implications that come from tariffs. Tariffs is just about adding a tax to anything that comes into the country from a different country, into the US, in this case, from other countries, which means there is an actual transfer of wealth from the citizens that will buy those products to the government that will collect a tax. And the president has made no secret about this. This is one of the ways in which he hopes to lower income taxes. If we can tax the foreigners, why would you tax the Americans? Except that you're really getting the Americans to pay that tax indirectly via higher prices. Because if you want to buy what's coming from another country, now you need to add the tariff to the price. Another thing that's important is that as a result of the higher cost or higher price of these imports, there will be some industries, companies, individuals that will benefit domestically if they are in the same industry and they produce those goods. And now their price is not as bad. If the problem was the price was too high, now the tariff might give them an advantage. So that is possible, but normally that will be a very small group of Americans. Very few in some companies or industries, maybe in some town or region will benefit, but the majority of us will be paying a tax via the tariff. So from the perspective of the overall good to the society, Mastandino believes that this does not make a lot of sense, although he does understand that there might be benefit when it comes to elections in those particular districts that would benefit from this change. So what we call distributional effects. Anytime you change a policy, there's going to be winners and losers. If you change who does what, who benefits from something, then those who stand to lose will be against it. Those who stand to gain will be for it. And that's what politics is about. This is what political economy is about. It's about the interaction of politics and economics. So Mastandino provides a very interesting summary of trade legislation in the US, and it goes back to the 1930s, right after the stock exchange crashed in 1929. And Congress ran to pass legislation on trade. So it is a legislative initiative to restrict imports. And the idea here is if we buy American, the jobs will come back. The problem with this is that in practice, it didn't really work that way because American companies were very productive. They were very efficient. So they were producing much more than the American people could buy, especially at a time of crisis. So a few years later, other countries did the same. They also passed protectionist policies. So what we got is the 1930s, a period where countries were engaging in economic warfare, economic nationalism. And the result was a crisis that was very serious, was made worse for this reason, which led Congress to come up in 1934 with a compromise, with a fix. Maybe we need to give the president the green light to strike trade agreements with other countries to try to counter the protectionist policies that we just put into place. What came out of this after a world war is the idea that economic nationalism very often comes with or fits into political nationalism. And then we got Imperial Germany, Japan, etc., etc. So after World War II, the US, along with the United Kingdom and the countries that won, decided to come up with a system of international relations that try to make cooperative set of rules to stick, so that instead of competing, instead of engaging in economic nationalism, countries found ways to integrate their economies by trade, via investment. So the idea here is we call this economic liberalism. So if I buy something from you, if I, in the States, buy something from Germany, since we're with World War II, I need the Germans to be in good shape so they can continue to produce that thing that I need. But at the same time, I'll need to be able to pay for that thing to the Germans, which means that the Germans will be buying something from me. We call this the principle of economic interdependence. So whether you like the Germans or not, whether you like people from different countries, the fact remains they're producing things that I need. So I need to take care of them. So the more economic interdependence that happens, the least likely countries are to go to war. And that's what led to the development of the Bretton Woods system, in which countries agreed to come together to sign a system of international laws to facilitate free economic relationships, free flows of investment so that people could take their money from one country to the other and make investments there, trade, so that it's the principle of non-discrimination. You can't discriminate against a product or a service based on the nationality of the people who made it. So as countries were coming up with their foreign policy, reconstructing after World War II, they were invited into this system. The US, the UK, and the countries that won the war decided to extend this system to countries that were not necessarily liberal, autocracies, on the idea that if we can get those countries to engage in economic relationships with us, they will modernize with us, they will become wealthy like us, and eventually, through economic development and transformation, their political systems will change as well, and they will eventually evolve into Western-style liberal democracies. The idea is South Korea will do that, Germany will move beyond Nazism and do that, Italy will forget fascism, think about Japan as well. So that is the thinking. And it pretty much worked. And American firms benefited along the way, because since the US was really not destroyed, the infrastructure of production in the US was not destroyed like it was in other countries, American companies came out of the war at full steam, full production. So the world could not compete with the quality of American products. So by helping other countries rebuild themselves and develop strong economies, they build demand for American products. And that facilitated the transition to peace. So what we have here is a list of trade-related acts that all follow the one that I mentioned in the 1930s. And I don't want to get into the specifics of them, but I do call your attention to a couple of things that President Trump has evoked when he decided to push for tariffs. One of them is to protect national security. That was introduced into law in 1962. He's also made reference to indiscriminate, unfair trade by other countries. That was added in 1974. He also talked about national emergency, also quoting a law from 1977. What's really interesting is that this legislation has been used as a tool of foreign policy by American presidents to get concessions from them, with the idea that I have all of these tools to constrain trade with you, but that's not what I want. I want you to open up, and I will open up as well. In fact, the US opened up to imports from other countries before those countries opened up to imports from the US. And the rationale for this is these countries that are destroyed by the war, if we don't allow them to export to the US so they generate the money so that they can get themselves established, our companies are going to drive them out of business. So how do we get that to go? So the US came up with a plan to gradually open up trade with the countries that were willing to join this system that had been destroyed after World War II. So at some point, it became very convenient for some of these countries. We mentioned Taiwan, we mentioned Japan and South Korea, to try to drag their feet in terms of opening up to the US. And that's when the US president said, I have these clauses that I've been applying along the way that I might have to invoke if you do not open up. But the point was really to open up. What's different now is that President Trump is bringing this up to close down pockets of the American economy to some of these imports. And that is a significant departure from standard practice. So with that, what Mastandona is raising here is that's where we are at. So what's coming up? What's coming in the next 3 years of the Trump administration? So it comes up with three potential scenarios. The first one is, well, things have been shaken up a little bit, but eventually when the dust settles, the US is going to go back to having these wonderful relationships with the old allies, all of those countries that fought alongside the US World War II and then other allies. He thinks that's the least likely scenario right now. And they will come together because they all have something in common. They feel threatened by China. That is the idea. China is the threat. What do? We all need to take China on at the same time. The second scenario that he believes is a little more likely is that the anti-China liberal coalition is really not coming together because they really have their own internal issues. But when China starts to squeeze, they will do that. So it will only take a major security threat from China, like China making a move on Taiwan, or China trying new weapons, when the US and the Europeans say, wait a minute, this is serious, we need to actually get back together in this. He thinks that's more likely, but not the most likely. The most likely scenario is the third one, which he claims actually has already been in the works for about a decade. And both Republicans and Democrats are together in this. So there is a very interesting quote that I think most people would have problems with. But I think is that, if you think about Trump and Biden, they're really not that different. So I'm sure that to most of us, that is quite a statement. But the argument is that they're not that different in the sense that they both believe that free trade for the US has really run its course. It's time to actually put some walls and protect the American economy for a number of reasons. And that he believes, Mastantuono believes, that the trend that began with the first period of Donald Trump in the late 2010s was really not that different from Biden, and it's not that different from what we see today, except that now it is speeding up. So what's going on with this? And the idea here is that the US is going to use its economy, the size of its economy, as an incentive to push for concessions from other countries that might involve access to their markets, but on unequal terms. Just like the US allowed countries to access the American market in the past, but those countries did not allow full access to American companies to theirs. Think Japan after World War II, think Germany. So the idea is the US is going to do that the other way around. If you want to sell your products in the US, you need to accept these tariffs and you need to buy our stuff. And your tariffs cannot be higher than mine. So the US is going to say, take it or leave it, which will lead to selective trade agreements. Some countries will agree to that, some countries will not, and some countries will decide, well, I think I have to find new friends, and they will be exploring the world. So he believes this is the way to go. This is the most difficult scenario because it means that the most dominant system of international trade that we had in place is now going to be significantly changed in directions that we don't exactly know. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to start moving into the next part of the presentation, but I have a couple of bridge slides here to call your attention to a couple of things. So before we do the reality check, is there evidence to believe that Mastantuono is correct based on the data? So a couple of things that I really want to emphasize here is the economic interdependency argument. The idea that is that the economy leads and everything else follows. If we can actually do business together, we will be able to live together. We're not going to kill one another. We might actually become partners or maybe even friends. The idea here is that many of those countries that began trading and investment within the US eventually became security partners, meaning that they actually signed a security agreement with the US, pledging to come to the rescue of the US if the US faced a major security threat. And that was one of the big successes of the US economic policy that spilled over into security policy. And that happened successfully because it was very appealing for three reasons. Three reasons that are very appealing to the American people that the Americans managed to sell via the UN system. One, the importance of institutions. We're all different, we want different things, but we can work together, we can live together if we abide by the same rules. And we have to have very strong institutions that are not corrupted, institutions that level the playing field to the best of our ability. So that's one, institutions that are deemed to be fair. Those institutions will be strong, will build trust, that will allow us to further our interest. Interest here defined as more wealth, more money, good jobs. I want to be rich rather than poor. So we have to have a system that allows for that as well. And the third one, ideology. If you're with me, don't challenge my values. Because I am who I am, and I am a Western-style liberal democracy that believes in that everybody's born free and equal, everybody has a chance to be president, everybody is going to be treated right, everybody is welcome into this community, and if you join this group, we apply that through trade. I don't discriminate against you because, you produce good stuff, regardless of who you are. I will accept your investment, you will accept mine. So those three I's, institutions that level the playing field and bring everybody together, in which we can realize our material interests and those that represent our values or ideology. And that, what Mastandino is saying here is that's really part of the core of foreign policy. If what you want as a country is to get others to help you achieve your policy goals, the best tools that you have is the power of your values. You make clear to other countries that your people expect you to abide by your values, to realize your interests. Because there isn't anything in it for me, it's going to be very hard for me to commit my people and my resources to help you out later. So I need to make sure that, I get something out of this. And the way to do that is by agreeing to the institutions by which we play. We play by the rules, we negotiate the rules. You don't stop playing if you don't like the rules. You keep playing, but then we change the rules. Okay, his argument is that the reason why he says that Biden and Trump are not that different is because he believes that going back to the dream that free trade is the way to go really has ended. For a number of reasons. One, domestic, because it's a very powerful blue-green coalition. The environmentalists don't like free trade because they believe that it lowers environmental standards in other countries. It's a way to get things to other countries where people can avoid American environmental regulations. And the second one is the labor lobby. Moving things abroad, buying things from other countries is a way to cheat on American workers because labor standards are lower abroad. So that normally not very friendly coalition, labor, environmentalists are together in this. And one of the arguments he develops is that both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party have a hard time with this because at the core, for both Democrats, especially old school Democrats and Republicans, the system was working well for the US. It wasn't working well for everyone, but it worked well for most. This is a radical departure. Donald Trump articulated this from the right. The system is broken. Free trade is not working for those reasons. Get me elected, I'll end this. Bernie Sanders articulated the same message from the left, but he wasn't quite as successful and lost. So that is the domestic component. Internationally, he argues, the argument is very similar too. Everybody believes China is so competitive because it's cheating. So therefore, a system of free trade only can go so far if everybody that agrees to the rules complies with the rules. But if there is this widespread expectation that China is cheating and China is now producing most of the things that we see at the store, what's in it for me? And this anti-China sentiment that is shared both in the US and other countries is really leading the world in a direction of protectionism, anti-China protectionism in particular. So Mastandino believes that if we don't like tariffs, tough luck. There's more coming. We better get used to them. because the Democrats have learned a lesson and they're not going to run on a platform of the world is sky's the limit, everybody free to move around. That era is over. So the second section is I will quickly go through some statistics that I collected about this. If it has been a decade of protectionism, a decade is quite a long time, enough for companies to switch production, trade from one region to the other. So what I wanted to do is look at the data and see if we do indeed see statistical evidence that the turn to protectionism has actually increased. And what we see here is that what hasn't changed is that the American trade deficit continues to grow. So that happened before the turn to protectionism, it continues now. So from that perspective, nothing has changed. But the data do show significant change. Protectionism had until 2025 led to an increase in the share of manufacturing as a share of the GDP in the US and manufacturing jobs until 2025. So take this with a huge grain of salt. Normally, a year could be a blip, but it is quite telling that the year when we really put those tariffs on steroids, we get the wrong policy goal. The idea is to bring manufacturing jobs to the US. Instead, we're not really getting that. But I do have a hypothesis for what's going on. I think this might be just a blip. If we take 25 out of the picture, we do see some manufacturing growing again, but very small. It's from 8% of GDP to 10%, so that's not a whole lot. This is where things start to get interesting. So we've seen that in the last 10 years or so, trade with China, while there is a significant deficit, imports from China have been falling down gradually. And that would be consistent with the idea that the tariffs are hurting trade with China. What's interesting is that the gap, the deficit has increased in the last year, but we think that what that means is that American companies rushed to place orders before the tariffs came into place. So we do think that the trend will continue to go down. Another interesting one is trade with the EU has increased significantly, even though the EU has been one of the main targets of the tariffs. That doesn't make sense. So Americans buy more European now that the tariffs make European goods more expensive. Well, what we think happens here is that many companies in the US are dependent on imports from the US, technology, software, other things. So they rush to place their orders in 2025 in anticipation of this. Here's the big loser, Canada. Trade with Canada has really, really fallen. Until Trump took over, Canada trade was up, in part because we call this nearshoring or reshoring. Some of the goods imported from China by American companies, production have moved to Canada. But because Canada has been very outspoken, a critic of the US, they're really taking the heat economically here. So trade with Canada is low down. Here's a surprise winner. Back, without making a lot of noise, Mexico is just loving it. While they're exchanging blows, trade with Mexico has increased a lot. And Mexico is the big beneficiary of this nearshoring. They have the technology, they have the qualified labor, it's close, and Mexico has been a very, very strong ally of the US. So I really think that some of that trade is being diverted to Mexico via investments, nearshoring investments into Mexico. So I think Claudia Sheinbaum, the president of Mexico, who's always very diplomatic, and people always ask her, how do you put up with these charges from Donald Trump every day? Here's why. I think there is a lot of discussing going on behind closed doors. So let's go to the third section of my presentation. So the second one basically proved that something is changing. So there is definitely evidence that protectionism is changing patterns of trade in the global economy, particularly affecting the US. So how likely are we that those three scenarios that he mentioned are going to be realized? The first one, he said least likely based on the evidence. Since he wrote the paper, he's right. I really don't think that a return to liberalism is happening. The US continues to sign trade agreements with countries that involve a significant degree of protectionism. So we don't really see that. I don't want to spend a lot of time on that one, unless people are interested in coming back to that during Q&A. The second one is, if there is a major security crisis, the US and their European liberal allies will come together. Well, there has been a major security crisis, is Greenland, but it was caused by a liberal country, the US, which has not brought the liberal allies together, quite the opposite. It has pushed them away. So I don't think Mastantuono expected this one. So that really kind of shattered the second scenario. It is quite interesting that he did not expect that the security threat would come from within NATO. So that is out of the question. So another thing that we do see here is I've been looking at trade agreements signed in 25 and 26. And what we see here is that the countries that have been the most active signing these agreements, such as, for example, the European Union, Mercosur, or India, Canada, China, they are not necessarily signing agreements with liberals or other liberal countries. Maybe with the exception of the European Union and Mercosur. Some people would argue that India is no longer a liberal democracy.
Who is Mercosur, for those of us that aren't?
Yeah, Mercosur is a bloc of countries in South America that is integrated by Argentina, Brazil, and the Guays, Paraguay and Uruguay. Yeah, great question. Thank you. And the European Union is a group of almost 30 countries in Western Europe. So it's an important trade agreement because that one brings together a quarter of the world's GDP. And the agreement between the EU and India is a fifth of the world's GDP. So those can have significant impact on patterns of world trade, which could affect the US indirectly if the center of world trade shifts away from the US and crosses the Atlantic. And it's from Western Europe all the way to China and India and South America. But I don't think this is the more likely scenario. Which leads us to the third, which I think is most likely. And the evidence provided suggests that Mr. Mastantuono has a reputation for a reason. I really think he sees where things are going, which is the idea that countries will engage in selective trade agreements regardless of the nature of the political system of the countries they signed the agreement with. So the idea that we all democratic-loving liberals will band together is gone. We find common interest in benefiting from each other's exports and imports and markets, but we're not going to talk about each other's values. We're going to talk about each other's political systems. So that's more or less the direction we're going. We see that the US is rushing to sign agreements as well. However, I emphasize what we said earlier, these are protectionist agreements. The US is signing agreements with these countries not necessarily to eliminate restrictions to trade, rather to add them, to domesticate trade, and to direct trade in the direction that the US president wants it to go. So we also see that the EU, as I mentioned, has been very active. These are some of the countries the EU has been busy signing agreements with. But I do want to spend a little bit more time talking about the importance of some of these agreements, because the European Union-India trade agreement is very significant. I mean, it's just about a fifth of the world's economy. The EU and India are major players in software and high tech as well. So if those two partners collaborate, a lot can come out of that. So the US, from my perspective, stands to lose a lot if they're not part of those agreements. There's a number of places in India that have become world-class research centers for high tech. India and the European Union are major investment partners as well. So there's a possibility that the trade agreement will lead to stronger investments. Normally, what we learn from trade is that trade happens until companies believe that it is cheaper, easier to grow in a market by making investments in that place, and rather than export from the home market to actually start production facilities or operations in a different country. There is normally a correlation between trade that is then followed by investment. When companies make an investment in a country, they lock themselves into that country in the long term. And there's a lot of transfer of know-how, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of cooperation. So it is very important to keep in mind that if we constrain trade, we might be missing out on significant investment opportunities. Although protectionism can also lead to some kind of investment when it tries to bypass protections. But in general, businesses don't like to be told what to do, where to invest, where not to do things. So they prefer to have a process of becoming familiar with the market first via exports and then by having a presence on the ground. And this is critical to the EU and India, as it is for Mercosur. Those two are very, very important. The critical part about Mercosur and the European Union is not so much high-tech and software, it's the fact that the European Union is a major exporter of high-end manufactured goods, which Mercosur is a major importer of. So those in Peoria and other parts of the country where they make agricultural machinery stand to lose a lot of business because those might actually be supplied now from Europe. And countries in Mercosur are major producers of food. Agriculture is very, very big, and their exports can really grow significantly into the EU. This is actually a very difficult issue in Europe because European farmers are really terrified by this change. European industry loves it. European farmers, not so much. So we'll see. But the point here, and I highlight that at the bottom to the right, is that they seek to develop strong economic relationships by eliminating up to or around 93% of limits. The reason why it's 93% is because the EU reserves the right to constrain imports of agricultural goods from South America. And there's a few manufacturing sectors in South America that also want to have some protection in case they feel that they're really threatened by the European imports. So, back to the idea. Before Donald Trump, the system of international trade was pretty much the way the Americans devised it after World War II based on those three ideas. Strong institutions that treat every country equally so that they can further their interest. If they benefit from it, they'll keep coming, and one that will help project American principles, the idea of freedom. People are free to vote. People are free to buy. The freedom of movement of goods, services, investment, finance, etc. That was very critical, a very important part of American foreign policy. And that led to, as I mentioned, security cooperation. Why are we facing this protectionist turn? And this is where I'm really moving away from Mastandino's argument. I'm building on some other scholarship that he doesn't build on. It's what we call the opportunity cost. One of the challenges of running a country is that you have to run the country for everybody, but not everybody benefits equally from every policy. So the result of that is that politics is always very complicated. So people tend to pay more attention not just to the overall good of a policy to society, but to me. How good is that policy if you're all doing great because you're not getting a lot of snow this year, but I in Beloit have 3 times more, plus below zero temperatures for a while. What's in it for me? Why should I like this government that dumps so much snow to the south when you guys to the north should be the ones receiving that? Okay, so I noticed that as I was driving here. There was a stretch between Grafton and Sheboygan. There was no snow for 10 minutes. I felt like spring. So what happened there? This is a mental break. Giving ourselves a pause. Cognitive science says that we need a break to bring out something irrelevant. So, if politics is about relative gains, not absolute gains, of course, the losers, we use this term very loosely in political economy, the losers are going to stand up when they're given a chance. This is not working for me. And they will be expecting a candidate to run for office on that ticket. You, the losers, well, they probably won't articulate it that way, but you take care of me, you get me to power, I'll take care of you. And they don't like us because the majority build this system that works for them. They're the elites, and they want to keep it going. But I have nothing to lose, nothing to fear. I'll stand up, I'll change things, and I'll give you the power. So this is very problematic, and in a way, one of the arguments that scholars bring up, why did this happen, is because in this post-World War II Bretton Woods system, there was what we call a compromise. Compromise, it was the idea that free trade is not an end in itself. Free trade is a policy to another end, which is to help people get what they want. But when trade starts hurting particular communities in countries, the system allows for exceptions, protections to free trade in the interest of protecting a particular city whose industry might be hurting. We call that selective protectionism, social compromise. But the argument that some scholars make is that starting in the 1970s and 80s in the US in particular, American foreign policy became dictated by what they call free market fundamentalism. The idea is that we're going to push free market, force every country to open up. We might have to open up as well. Forget all of those restrictions, those clauses that allow us to allow for restrictions to free trade when trade does not work for us. And then free trade and the signing of free trade agreements became an end in itself. And any departure from free trade almost felt like an economic sin. And that's what got us here today, to Donald Trump and the tariffs, according to a couple of scholars whose name you'll see in a minute. So, and what made this possible is that they did have legal instruments to implement these kinds of policies, to bring back the protections and the restrictions to trade. One of them was Joseph Stiglitz, a professor who wrote this book in the 1990s, which is very relevant today. It's called Globalization and Its Discontents. In the book, he talks about how globalization and the expansion of free trade, international investment, etc., has led to the highest rates of economic growth since the 1940s the world has ever seen, and the biggest reduction in poverty rates the world has ever seen. And yet, we don't like it. And that's the discontent part. So a few people are being left behind, and if a smart politician comes up, he argues, they will get that politician elected, and they will put an end to the story, which has benefited the majority. But in some societies where elections are this thin, those, if they rally behind the person, then there will be others who probably stand to lose if that one gets elected, but they will choose that one over the alternative, and boom, then the system is going to be wrecked. It's very easy to make people lose faith in the institutions. It's very hard to get it back. And that is the argument that he's raising. So he said, if we in the US are playing with fire, because if a politician starts bringing this up, and it will start a little bit, and then say the next thing, and send the next thing, and then get away with it, next thing you know, we're electing a populist, he said. So if free trade fundamentalism is the problem, then what's going to happen? So the idea is that it shouldn't have been. We should have just stuck with the fundamentals of the Bretton Woods system. Don't think of trade as an end in itself. Think about trade as an instrument of policy to achieve what society needs. If you need something that you don't produce, get it from a different country. Other countries will get from you what they don't produce. But don't force them to open up blindly without knowing exactly what trade agreements you're getting yourself into. So that is very important. Let's make sure trade tariffs is just an instrument that society will use to pursue a greater good and focus on the greater good. What is it that we need to do? That's why the escape clauses to free trade agreements are critical, because free trade agreements are not expected to work for everyone because we don't live in a homogeneous society. We simply don't. We have inequality. Not everybody participates in these institutions equally. There is discrimination, etc., etc. And those wrongs have to be righted somehow by making exceptions. That was Stiglitz's argument. That is also an argument by Daniel Roderick, a very prominent professor and other economists who wrote about this. So what do we do now? So, well, let's have a straight talk on trade, he suggested. And the argument is that as a person who specializes in trade, he thinks trade is overrated because trade is not going to give you everything you want. Trade is not going to give you spiritual peace. It's not going to help you love your neighbor much more than you do now. Those are things that are very important to people. It's not going to make you happier about your identity, individual, as a group. And when people go to vote, they vote on these things. And then there is trade. So we need to acknowledge that, in the big scheme of things, trade, tariffs, foreign policy is a little thing. But it's a little thing that can have a significant impact on the very existence of some communities that could be completely decimated if in a system of free trade, their local factory gets wiped out of the map. So the people who were there, who were born and raised there, who had an identity, are gone. The minute they go to Chicago, everything that goes to Chicago goes to die there. Well, not quite. It gets reinvented. Chicago is one of our suburbs, so I like to pick on them when I get a chance. So what do we need to do about this? So Roderick said trade and economic policy is very complicated. We should not really emphasize it as much as we do. And as a society, he came up with what we call the trilemma. Societies normally are asked when making policy to make a compromise between democracy, national sovereignty, and economic interdependence or integration with other countries. And his argument is you can only have two, but no country has been able to get all three because they're incompatible. So the system of free trade fundamentalism was based on the assumption that all three can be realized at once, and now we know they haven't. And what we see with the age of tariffs and protectionism is that American democracy has made the American people elect a president that believes that national sovereignty is what the democratic people want, and they don't want economic integration with the rest of the world. In Hong Kong, for example, they want economic integration with the rest of the world, and national sovereignty. Democracy, not so clear. Singapore, many countries went that route. So if you go down the list, you're going to see that the argument that Roderick puts on the table is a very important one. And he basically wrote mostly for Western-style liberal democracies for a long time to tell them, you can only have two of these. Think about which ones you want. And being an internationalist, international trade, he actually thought that democracy is incredibly valuable, particularly in his case coming from a persecuted group that would have disappeared if it weren't for democratic liberal systems. And the idea is that national sovereign systems work best when the world is not on the same page ideologically. So in that sense, the internationalist is saying, let's not oversell the international aspect of it. Countries should exercise their protections from things that come from abroad to protect themselves so they can realize their national goals. If they're told that that's the wrong thing to do because they have to open up, things are not going to go well. And that's where we are at today. So what do countries have to do? According to Roderick, the economy itself is just another instrument that we have for societies to do other things. But the market itself, the economy, is staying, but those other things and the institutions that they make function, that they facilitate, that they make just, a semblance of justice is very important. It's what we call that the legal and the lawful should come together. But the lawful piece has been missing. So those institutions are necessary. They create markets. They create trade. They regulate trade. They regulate markets. They stabilize markets and trade when they falter. They legitimate trade and markets because they help us when they falter. It's what John Ruggie, a professor of international relations, called the liberal compromise or embedded liberalism. The idea of liberalism is individual rights, free trade, free economy, but at some point, by doing what's good for you, sometimes that's up to something that's bad for society as a whole. Then the state has to come back in and fix the problem. So we call this embedded liberalism. So states and markets need one another. And the idea of free market fundamentalism believe that markets can function without governments. What we see here is that that's questionable at best, but that's undemocratic at worst, because people do want their governments to function, and they want their governments to tame the economy when the economy doesn't work for them. That's what's on the table. So he ends with a very strong conclusion. Let's not forget that trade and the economy are about states and societies, and they should be given the autonomy to use trade and the economy to pursue their own goals, wherever they might be, and regulate them accordingly. So, are we witnessing the end of free trade if we go in that direction? So, just like Stiglitz and Roderick tend to be a little pessimistic about the age of absolute free trade, they also say no. Most people who have tried free trade and capitalism would argue that, it's better than what we have seen in other parts of the world. So it might not be ideal, but let's just keep that, but let's just make it work, and let's keep equipping the people with the tools to manipulate those, and manipulate, I put that in inverted commas, so that it actually achieves the social purpose that life in community seeks to achieve. Market fundamentalism is a social project that is based on the premise that the most important value is the accumulation of wealth. What Roderick, Stiglitz argue is that life is not like that for most people. The production of wealth is important because it improves quality of life, but people's meaning comes from other things. It comes from the spiritual world. It comes from education. It comes from wellness. It comes from health. It comes from enjoying community. It comes from church. And the market should facilitate that. It is the market, it's trade that should be a function of our ability to achieve the others. So if we get that right, we can actually find some kind of more stable status moving forward, but always remembering that international relations, trade policy is a function of the above. So where is Donald Trump's tariffs getting us? Roderick probably would not enjoy the way that Donald Trump has been threatening the world with tariffs, because he would have said, just because you're losing, you don't stop playing the game. You just negotiate the rules. But if you stop the game, everybody's going to be bored, and nobody's going to invite you to play the game again. So let's just finish this game and then change the rules. And that's what Roderick would have advised. Don't do it unilaterally. It took decades to build a multilateral system that everybody, for the most part, complies with because they all get to sit at the table. If now you change the rules unilaterally, you're telling the others, you are a taker. You have no choice. And they will perceive the system to be illegitimate, therefore undemocratic. And they are less likely to want to cooperate with you. And that's how you start losing your economic allies and eventually your security allies. And that's where the US might be going in the wrong direction. It's not the idea of reining in trade, it's how it is being done. So what we need is to amend, but not to bypass the system, because it took a long time to build. Because to give credit to the US, after World War II, the US was so powerful, it could have forced every country to be a taker, but the US said no. We want you to sit at the table, and we want to be together in this. In fact, I'm going to be on the receiving end. I'm going to let you protect some of your industries until they're competitive. So the US is pretty much asking that, but it's really asking it the wrong way. It should be coming to the table and say, I was there for you in the 1930s and 40s, now I want you to be there for me. If we do that, the system will continue to be legitimate, the adjustments will be minor, but every country will be able to participate, and therefore they will have a stake in making it happen and making it work. The change will then be flexible as well. Countries will be able to introduce policy changes in a flexible way. Sometimes, like the European does, there is 90% of the rules that apply to all, and then there's a 10% that make exceptions, which in a way is not as different from the federal system in the United States. The US federal government sets some policy goals, standards, but then the states have the freedom to go further if they will. But working with other countries remains very important, whether they're allies or not. Those who are not allies today might be allies tomorrow. The system of multilateralism is critical because the US cannot get everything alone, and foreign policy depends on trust, and it depends on reciprocity. And if the US loses that, it will be in a much more difficult situation in the future to be able to get help from others when that help is needed. So that is the big risk that we have here. The European Union and China have already started to collaborate. The EU finds it harder to work with China than with the United States because they have a lot less in common with China. China doesn't like the European Union because part of the European Union's foreign policy is the promotion of democracy, human rights, and the EU is a very spoken critic of China. But facing the situation that China-US relations is facing today, even China is willing to take that. And the European Union is also holding its nose and saying, well, we're going to have to tie the knots with China for now and see what happens here. So for the EU, working with the US is best. If you remember that stat that I showed you in 2025, exports and imports from the US have really gone up. That really suggests there is a lot of complementarity between those two that might be lost. And China might be taking an advantage of that. The way that China sees this is the US is retreating. They can no longer run the world they built. They're getting weak, and we are rising. We play their game better than themselves, and now we're climbing to the top, and we're going to continue to push this game to the world, except they're going to be running it. And the EU is saying, we'll see about that. So that's where we're at. So what has the impact been on the American economy? What we see in just 1 year, we see that the value of the dollar versus the euro has collapsed. This is amazing. It's lost about 20% of its value, which is not necessarily a bad thing, because by lowering the value of your currency, that means that American exports are cheaper in comparison. But if the US is signing protectionist agreements, other countries are not going to want to buy them. So that doesn't help. But this also means that if American products are cheaper, the Europeans, by importing American, will actually lower inflation, which means that living standards will increase in Europe, and the wealth of the Europeans will increase vis-a-vis the Americans. So this is a de facto impoverishing of American society vis-a-vis the rest of the world. We're becoming more competitive, not because we're building better, but because we're cheaper. That's what China did until now. So another interesting fact, and this is telling us a different story. Where do governments and companies park their wealth, their savings? In what currency? Here what we see is that in 1 year, little has changed. The US dollar remains by far the currency of choice. Even though it's losing value, most governments park their savings in US dollars. It's gone down by 2 points that have been gained by the euro, but in general, they're still pretty much what they are. The Chinese renminbi has gone down a little bit, but not significantly. So there's lots of statistics here. These are some general indicators that provide a very cold snapshot of where the world's economy was in 2025. What we see here is that in general, the US is not leading in these indicators. It doesn't have the fastest rates of growth, although it's really not the worst. The US is leading in terms of deficit, government debt, no surprises there. What that means is that we have a long-term problem, that a part of the growth of this economy has been a function of the government pumping money into the economy that the US government didn't have. So for as long as, back to this, for as long as the world savings are parked in dollars, the US can continue to do that. But for how long will that remain the case? So we don't know that. But that's what a French president said, that's exorbitant privilege, that the US can run more deficits than other countries just because people will lend them money, but they wouldn't lend to the French. So that's where we're at today still, and that is a significant thing to think about. But I want to invite you to look at the bottom interest rate. What the financial markets are telling us, however, is that it is riskier to lend money to the US government than it is to lend it to China, Japan, or the EU. The interest rate is about 4.3% right now. That is normally an indicator of how the finance sector regards government policy. It's not terrible, they're not very far apart, but that's where they are. And right now, for example, the interest rate on loans for the governments of Greece, Italy, that are historically known for having a hard time to borrow money, the interest rate is a lot lower. So that is also very telling. If you see the big one there is Russia. Nobody wants to lend money to Russia now. So wars don't, really make the financial markets feel very, very positive about countries. So I really want to bring it to an end and then maybe open up a discussion. So what to look for in 2026? We don't seem to be facing the end of the world. So that's the good news. The economy remains fairly steady. It's really, we're not going through the best time in history, but we do have a few things to worry about. Government debt are high. Businesses are very highly indebted as well. So that is something that in the long term could have potential implications. A big problem is that all of those could actually take a turn for the ugly if there is another major security crisis. If the Ukraine crisis continues, if the Gaza crisis continues, if the troubles continue in Yemen, in Congo, those countries that are facing world, and those could have a significant change in access to resources, rare earths, other materials that are necessary for the development of some of the technology that we have today. Which leads me, in a way, to be in agreement with Mastanduno. If things don't work perfectly, just fix the problem, but don't throw out the baby with the bath water. Multilateralism has worked very well. It allowed the US to pull China away from the Soviet Union at a time when that seemed impossible. If the international system could do that, why would you break away from that? So go back to that, keep it where it was, just make sure that people are given a voice and listen to your society. Remember that trade is an instrument. It's not an end in itself. It's a very important one, but it's an instrument. It should not be an end of policy. But that doesn't mean that we need to put an end to that. We still need the world, but the world needs to understand that, not all Americans want us to open up, and that is legitimate. So negotiate that. Make sure that we have an international trade regime that is, again, perceived to be legitimate. Things become stable, and everybody will be very happy. I sound like President Trump sometimes with these superlatives. So I wanted to end on a positive note. So thank you very much for your patience, and I'm sure that everybody has great comments, ideas. I know there's always challenging questions, so I'll let Tim take the hard ones, and I'll take the easy ones.
All right. That sounds like a good plan.
Yes, it is.
We have two people with microphones, myself and Stacy Bialik, who should be somewhere on the other side of the room. Stacy Bialik. Anyway.
I saw somebody leave a minute ago. So.
Okay. He is the facilities manager,
okay.
So he may have been called away for a minute. So raise your hands. I will get to you with your questions. Questions, comments. Just remember to listen to what other people are saying, because listening is never a bad idea, and be respectful of what other people are saying as well. So let's get rolling.
What happens if the U.S. loses its status as the reserve currency?
Well, that is a fantastic question. President Nixon played with that when he decided to float the American dollar, and there was a critical moment where things could have gone in many different directions. But there's a number of reasons that lead us to believe that that is not going to happen. If it did, the consequences could be astronomical. Our mortgages would probably be more expensive. Borrowing across the board would be more expensive, and we would probably be facing periods of economic slowdown, high unemployment, like we haven't seen before. So that could potentially be one of the consequences. The reason why I don't think it is likely to happen is because, in spite of the value of the U.S. dollar going down, international reserves are still going to the dollar. So even the most sovereign funds that are the ones that really making a huge bet is that the dollar will remain the reserve currency, even though it's losing value right now. And one of the reasons for that is because some major commodities are traded in dollars. And that's why the U.S. has a big investment in the Middle East. The U.S. is really not the main importer of oil or gas from the Middle East. Other countries are. But because of the history of multilateralism with the Middle East, those transactions are conducted in dollars. And even though it is the exporting countries with the importing countries dealing with one another, they use an American currency. And that helps us keep the dollar as the world currency. And that is not changing. Every now and then there's being voices coming out of Saudi Arabia in particular. Maybe we need to start using the euro, some other currencies. China has been very interested in promoting the renminbi as a currency of reference in the world. The world normally doesn't do that. They prefer to use the US dollar. And those reserves in euro tend to be countries that do significant amounts of business with the European Union. So the EU is a very serious referent economically, but the US dollar for now remains very strong. So I don't think we need to worry about that one. I think there is a hand here.
1 second, I'll be right there. Thank goodness that was one of the easy questions.
Yeah, you're getting this one.
There you go.
It's a little bit of a substantiating comment. Part of the reason is if you look at the 1990s, I worked in finance and off Wall Street then. There was a certain amount of trade settlements that were going in Swiss francs. The EU was gaining in value, and that was thought to be a competitor. It didn't happen. If you look at the past 8 or 9 months, China has been selling more U.S. treasuries than it has been buying. Japan is doing the same, nowhere near as much as the Chinese, but the Japanese are the biggest investors in U.S. treasuries. Part of the reason is you can only sell for so long before the value of the portfolio you hold in U.S. treasuries loses significant value. And that's a deterrent which puts a stopgap on how far you can reduce your position in U.S. treasuries. And that's part of the reason that both the Chinese with the renminbi as well as, say, the EU in being a trade settlement currency face significant headwinds ahead.
Thank you. Well, on the EU, very often I hear that the euro is so powerful that many countries outside of the EU use the euro as their currency. But those countries are the Vatican, San Marino, Andorra, Monaco, Liechtenstein. So if you think about it, all of those combined probably have about the same population as Beloit. I won't say Manitowoc, because you're a big city. Yes.
Anyone have any other questions? Oh.
I think I can talk loud enough.
Well, but a microphone is coming.
I have a question about the third point, the idealism. As we move away from liberalism to the more protectionism, do we lose out on ideology? Because it seems like that's already happening in the United States.
Yeah, that is a fascinating debate in the world of international relations right now. Is the US still a liberal democracy? I want to believe that it is, but the idea of liberalism is the idea that we believe intrinsically that everybody's born free and equal, that everybody deserves an equal shot at success, that everybody will get the help that they need to get that equal shot at success, and that the job of the government is to be there to facilitate everyone. But some of the rhetoric used by the president does not suggest that. So, and this is one of the challenges. I do believe that most Americans remain wedded to liberalism, but you wouldn't know that by listening to the narrative of the president, who tends to dismiss certain people as second-class citizens on the basis of some marker of identity. And that is extremely illiberal. And people tend to learn from the leaders, and they feel validated by the leaders. So the risk of the president using this kind of rhetoric is that members of society more and more will start to believe that, the government is not there for all. It's there for us, but not for them. And the enemy is at home, which is not the idea of a liberal society. We are different, and yet we work together because we respect each other's differences, and we're stronger together, and we create institutions that will help one another. And that is the idea. So that is the big challenge. And there's lots of discussions going on, particularly in other liberal societies of the world, in Europe, Western Europe in particular, and Latin America. So whatever happened to liberalism? The country that did the most to promote liberalism in the last century seems to be resigning. So it's almost like the world of liberalism is losing its leader. And that is a significant problem for the world of liberalism, because one of the reasons why Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping of China like President Trump is because they hear that, oh, things are changing there. So the Europeans keep telling us how bad we are, but the Americans don't. In fact, the American president praises us in different ways. So China and Russia have a very uneasy relationship with Donald Trump, because on the one hand, they like the idea that he doesn't push liberal values. The US executive does not shame China for their treatment of minorities, like President Biden did. So, but at the same time, he's a nationalist, American nationalist. So he looks at China and Russia with a lot of caution. So they don't know exactly whether Donald Trump is good or bad for them. But the jury's still out there. So that's what makes Donald Trump such an interesting political character from an international relations perspective, that even the friends don't know that he's a friend and the enemies don't know that he's an enemy.
That's true.
I'd like to bring this home to something that's going to affect everyone here in Wisconsin. You mentioned the word equality. Everybody's equal in one definition. But there's going to be a referendum on our ballot this fall in asking us if we believe that everything should be equal. And that sounds really good. But the question is, because equal is mentioned in the Constitution, but equality isn't. I mean, I think back to, we all know that we're all equal, but do I have the same skills you have? No. Do I know as many people as Darlene does? No. We're not equal, but we have different skills, and each one of us should be educated to the best of our level, not equally. You're not going to take the course that I would take to learn how to cook. You have different skills. So it is a very, very, very narrow difference in the two words, and I'm really, I'm scared that the election is going to pass it. It's passed once already on an amendment, and it's going to get added to the Constitution. Everything that might possibly train someone who doesn't have skills like you to become the best they could is going to be Well, no, I'm gonna give them the same chance you had, and no extra tutoring, no extra help, no wheelchair in the classroom, no teacher, no extra class. So I just think changing the system of government is going to have effect in everybody's backyard.
Yes, and I think one of the points to bring it to international relations, which is the subject of this presentation, we're getting into the idea that liberalism also calls for the need to help protect minorities, to allow those who can't make it to make it. And that might lead to some form of extra resources to be made available to some groups. We often think about negative rights as those that are enforced by the government by staying away from people's lives. Give people the right to speak, the right of association, the right to work. This idea is that those rights are realized simply if the government takes a step back and gives freedom to society. But then there is what we call the socioeconomic or positive rights, right to education, healthcare, shelter, job, training. The idea that here is that for everybody to have access to those rights, the government will have to support in some circumstances. And that is the idea of tariffs, the way the tariffs were built in international trade law. If a community relies, think about Detroit, car manufacturing, and you open up to free trade, and that takes that industry out of commission because it can't compete. There is guarantees in international trade treaties that allow the U.S. to violate the free trade of cars to protect Detroit. Just like the US agreed to let other countries do that. And this is the idea of liberalism. It's not a blanket rule that applies everywhere all the time. That would be the concept that I mentioned, fundamentalism. But liberalism is the idea that, while we all have equal opportunity, some people will need extra resources because they don't have the privilege or they don't have those resources. The state might have to step up and provide those resources. That is one of the ideas of embedded liberalism that I mentioned earlier. I think there was another hand here for a while, and there's another one there. I don't know who's first.
Okay, my question, if I understand correctly, is the tariffs impact foreign relations. How much U.S. debt is owned by other countries, and are the tariffs going to cause those countries to call in the debts?
Yeah, that's a question that became very clear during the financial crisis in this country. And it happened with the debt crisis in the 1980s in Latin America. So financial markets are very global. So the big players hold each other's debts. So I don't think China is going to pull back. They're not going to sell their assets in dollars, as we heard. It's not that simple. But it is in China's interest to keep the U.S. functioning because the U.S. still remains a major partner. So this is the point that I spoke about earlier, the concept of interdependence. The idea that if I need you and you need me, even if we don't like each other, we'll find accommodation. And this is one of those cases in which the U.S. Likes to live on credit, but China wouldn't function if they didn't give credit to the U.S. So that's why China in the last few years under Xi Jinping has been pivoting economic growth from exports to domestic internal growth. And that has really come to a stop because domestic growth was fueled by the real estate markets. And that has also come to a stop. So China is right now not in the best of situations because they have a lot of domestic problems and they need access to those markets. So they need the US to continue to buy, even if the US seems to be moving in a different direction. And I think that's what President Trump is banking on, the idea that sooner or later China is going to have to come to terms with his terms because they need Americans to continue to buy Chinese. And that's where we're at. Pulling in different direction.
I'm looking at what's happening from a slightly different perspective in that, you're talking about tariffs and you're talking about tariffs as how they've done it. But we're in a period now where, using the instrument of tariffs is being done very, very recklessly, punitively, arbitrarily. There doesn't seem to necessarily be a policy goal in a lot of them. In other words, somebody says something bad about Trump, and so he increases the tariff from 35% to 60%. And who, it's only been the first year, so it may not have had an impact yet. But it seems to me that it's going to be very, very difficult for this government to reach agreements because they can't be trusted, because they're arbitrary and unpredictable, and that already countries are starting to shift from trying to work with the United States to trying to get deals with China and India. I mean, Mark Carney, made a big deal with China. And that's because, a deal that was negotiated in Trump's first term, the new NAFTA deal, he's just cream canned on that. So who's gonna trust that government or the American system, which could produce that, every other term could produce a government with similar attitudes? How is that going to do anything but erode the willingness of other countries to do business, or at least to do politics with the United States?
Yes, I mean, in essence, Mastandino raised that very point. So he basically says it's unpredictable, and international relations is based on predictability and also trust. You mentioned trust. There's an American political philosopher called Francis Fukuyama who wrote this book called Trust, and he said, liberal society, the beauty of liberalism is that it's built on trust. You don't have to know a person to trust that that person will honor a contract. You don't have to know a person to trust that that person will deliver the goodies that you contracted to them. You don't have to know a person to trust that there will be the right teachers at the school. You don't have to know that person to trust the farmers are complying with the law so that they're doing food that is safe. So this is the idea. In the end of the day, a political system that functions and relies on trust is stronger because it facilitates meritocracy. If we can only trust the people we know, we are not going to be working with the people with the right skills. But if we have a strong system of institutions in place that make sure that we all meet together in the same place on the basis of what we need, how we need to collaborate, and that we are to be trusted, if only because if we break the law, the system will punish us, then we can have business, then we can have education, then we can have politics. And that is the idea of liberalism. You have to trust that I will honor my contract and you will as well, but just in case we have the law. And in case we have to go to the courts. And that's what the international trade system is based on. A system of basic laws that say that we are going to move towards the elimination, full elimination of restrictions to trade. Not that we'll get there, but the idea is that we will, and we'll continue to talk about it. That's what the trade negotiations are about. But now, as you said, going solo is a breach of that trust. And that really has implications in the future because it makes it harder for other countries to trust the U.S. the long-term. The fact that the U.S. will be trusted. And businesses like predictability. They don't like the rules to change from one day to the other. Very often in the book, in the booklet, they mentioned that in the end of the day, I made this comment that there's not such a big difference between Trump and Biden on tariffs. The only difference is that Biden tends to favor renewable industries and greenery because that's a solid, millions of votes that he gets if he does that, versus Donald Trump, who tends to favor aging, struggling manufacturing, because that's a solid group of losers, to use the discontents terminology that was used by Stiglitz. The idea is that if I appeal to those, they'll vote for me and they will get me elected and I'm the savior. So that's where we're at. Yeah. 1 second.
Yeah, I'd like to maybe follow up on Dr. Trask's point. I'm concerned that I think that this administration is isolating us in the world. That's pushing Europe and China, Europe and Canada to deal with China and India and South America, and that it's probably not going to be good for our economy in the long run to lose some of this positives that we've got from leadership in the world since World War II. But I also I'd like to suggest to see what we think about the idea that it's maybe better for the world as a whole, for Europe to be pushed to take some sort of leadership, for Carney and Canada to say, you know, if we're not at the table, we're on the menu, and therefore suggest that they need to take more leadership, that the United States, which now seems to be leading in the wrong direction in a variety of things like global warming and other international interests, will be better off if the United States has a little less influence and there's more than just two countries, you know, two focus points. So,
yeah, can I maybe add a footnote to your comment? I really don't have a whole lot to add, but you made me think about the idea of what can we do. Our students are always, what can I do about this? So just last week, two weeks ago, time flies, we had a speaker at Beloit College who spoke about the concept of citizen diplomacy. So one of the arguments that he developed is that his name is David Wellman. He teaches diplomacy at DePaul University in one of our suburbs in Chicago. And one of the arguments that he develops is we tend to think about diplomacy as the work of a few people who strike deals in closed rooms in the name of people they don't know, that they probably dislike. And then they tell us we comply with it. And he was using a quote from the son of a diplomat. Who he claimed is an amazing diplomat. He said, no, my dad is a diplomat. He strikes deals in dark rooms with people he hates, and then he asks people he doesn't know to implement them. So it's like, I'm not that kind of person. I am a person, I'm a citizen. And then he introduced the concept of citizen diplomacy. The majority of international relations are really not conducted by governments. Governments create a framework and the institutions that allow us to travel abroad on tourist trips, that allow us to go abroad to strike business deals with others, that allow us to host international students when they come here. That's where the true diplomacy happens. Most diplomacy are those interactions from citizen to citizen. And when the people go back home, that's what really stays. And then people realize, oh, not all Americans are like Donald Trump. Not all Americans are like John Biden. There's actually women in America as well. So there is other things. And there's young ones as well. So the concept of citizen diplomacy is very appealing because he argues, why is it that we haven't really been thinking about this kind of diplomacy, which is the one that makes the biggest difference? Our perception of other countries are most likely going to be influenced by the people we know from those countries, not by the politicians that represent those people on TV. If that is the power of citizen diplomacy, why are we not doing more of it? So one of his arguments is that, he was talking about work that has been done in Germany, Austria, France, and then he was using as a case study Chicago. So think about the ICE raids in Chicago and think about the ways in which people of different backgrounds in Chicago are coming together because all of a sudden they've seen their neighbors taken away. It's like, I don't know why this person is being taken from home, but this has been my neighbor forever. And then people are organizing themselves to tell everybody else, like, I don't know who they're trying to get, but you need to know, so you blow the whistle. So it's talking about how, in a very disorganized but a genuine way, people have been getting together to help the other. And some of that has been used in Minneapolis. We know that things are not ideal there right now. But the idea is this kind of citizen diplomacy is probably preventing bigger problems. And when you feel your government is failing you, you engage in your own diplomacy. You reach out to the other and try to find ways to make them realize that we're together in this. The government doesn't necessarily speak for me. The government facilitates. But in the end of the day, I am the American people.
And unfortunately, that is all the time we have, so that we can all leave in an orderly fashion and be out of the building by 8, which I know you think is my mantra. It's just something I have to follow. One last thing from someone online, Janet Froker, not so much a question, but brilliant speaker. Thank you to you. So
Thank you. We opened with tariffs and we ended with the American people. Isn't that amazing? Thank you.
thank you for coming, everyone. Next week, we have another great and unsettling topic, ruptured alliances and the risk of nuclear proliferation, with the recently retired Martin Farrell from Ripon College. So, hope to see you all again next week. Have a great night, drive safe, and stay warm.
Thank you very much for coming out today.
I never did give a chance to ask.